The last thing he heard was the crack of the gunshot, echoing in a room where he should have been safest. Some people escape their trauma. Some become defined by it. For Officer Daniel Reed, a childhood spent shielding others would forge an identity as a protector and ultimately blind him to the threat living within his own home. This story is built not from one moment of violence, but from 100 smaller fractures that everyone, especially Daniel, tried to explain away. It's a blueprint of a tragedy, drawn long before the final fatal line was ever inked. February 5th, 2015. A quiet town in California's Central Valley holds its breath. In a courtroom 10 years later, a verdict is read. Guilty of first-degree murder. For the family, that word was a relief, but not a resolution. Because a verdict is just the period at the end of a very long, very dark sentence. A sentence written in choices ignored, fears minimized, and a lethal obsession that everyone saw coming. This isn't just a murder case. It's a case study in how control disguises itself as passion, and how the person trained to spot danger can be the last to see it when it wears a familiar face. We so often look for monsters in shadows, but the most dangerous ones know how to stand in the light just long enough to seem human. Daniel Reed's story starts in survival mode. Raised alongside his twin brother, Michael, and a younger sister, Chloe, their home was a battleground. The stepfather, with a violent temper, turned ordinary days to exercises in fear. The boys, Daniel in particular, made it their mission to stand between the anger and their sister. It teaches them that love is a shield, a dangerous wiring that can misfire years later in an adult relationship. The teenager, a kind local cop, Sergeant Miller, showed him another way to be strong, strength with purpose, authority tempered by compassion. Sergeant Miller saw the wary resolve in the young man and took him under his wing, offering glimpses of patrols and community outreach. For Daniel, it was a revelation. He found his calling. He joined the force, ascending to an 11-year veteran described by colleagues as deeply empathetic. The cop who would spend extra time with a scared robbery victim or a lost child. He was the officer you'd want to show up on your worst day. Yet, off-duty, he sought an outlet for the pressure. A motorcycle club gave him that. But his deepest desire was simpler, a family of his own, a peaceful home. He met Ilara at a mutual friends gathering. She was 24, sharp, witty, and carried an intensity that was magnetic. To Daniel, her fiery spirit felt exciting, invigorating. Here was someone who felt things deeply, who wasn't afraid of passion. Their romance was a whirlwind, a vortex that pulled them in quickly. They married in Reno less than a year later, in a small chapel ceremony that felt more like an elopement. Even at the celebration, warnings flashed like distant lightning. A friend from his riding club cited specific instances where he'd witnessed Ilara's temper flare. Daniel brushed it off. When you fought so hard for a happy ending, you sometimes accept a flawed draft, convincing yourself you can edit the bad parts later. The mask slipped quickly, and the editing never came. Arguments erupted in their apartment, loud, theatrical performances of anger that echoed in the hallway. Neighbors grew accustomed to the sound. One chilling episode, Ilara, in a cold rage, took a kitchen knife to their living room furniture. An act of symbolic destruction that hinted at a frightening capacity for harm. Daniel was left bewildered and heartbroken, staring at the guts of his own home. The siblings Michael and Chloe watched from the periphery with growing alarm. They saw Ilara's subtle and not so subtle attempts to pull Daniel away from them, criticizing their visit, picking fights before family gatherings. The protector was now the one needing protection, a role he was psychologically incapable of accepting. By early 2012, the marriage, a fragile vessel, finally shattered on the rocks of constant conflict. Divorce papers were signed, a stark legal end to a turbulent union. If this were a fairy tale, that would be the closing of a bad chapter. But for Daniel and Alara, it was merely an intermission, a brief pause before the main feature resumed with greater force. Soon after the papers were filed, Alara told him she was pregnant. How does a man built on duty, whose core operating system is protection, respond? For Daniel, the idea of abandoning his child was unthinkable. They reconciled, clinging to the hope that a baby would act as a reset button for their broken dynamic, a tiny life powerful enough to mend their fractures. Instead, the control tightened, the dynamic now laced with the immense responsibility of a coming child. Alara's disdain for his motorcycle, his one tangible piece of independence and identity, grew more vocal. She called it childish, dangerous, a waste of money. Then, a tangible escalation. Daniel went for a ride. As he approached a busy intersection, his brakes failed completely. He careened through a red light, weaving through cross-traffic in a moment of pure, terrifying luck. A shaken mechanic later found the brake lines had been cleanly cut. Deliberate act of sabotage. Confronted, Alara admitted to cutting some wires, but pleaded ignorance of the consequences, framing it as a desperate act to keep him safe, to keep him home. It was a direct, physical attempt on his life, and yet standing at this glaring red line, Daniel did not go to the police. Why would a cop, sworn to uphold the law, not report an attempted murder? The answer is a tangled web. Shame. The profound embarrassment of a domestic violence detective becoming a domestic violence victim. Hope, a stubborn belief that for the sake of his unborn son, the mother could still be reasoned with. And finally, a lifetime of conditioning that handled threats internally, to absorb and manage rather than escalate and expose. It was a silence that would cost him everything. Their son, Leo, was born in the spring of 2013. Daniel was radiant with the fatherly love that friends said transformed. In a gesture of peace, he sold his motorcycle. The symbol of freedom was traded for the hope of domestic peace. But the calm is fragile, a thin veneer over old tensions. By summer, the arguments resumed, poisoned by the stress of a newborn. What followed was a bitter custody war, fought not in courtrooms, but in texts, laced with venom and strategic withdrawals of cooperation. Yet the toxic bond held a perverse gravity. It would sometimes spend nights together, a confusing dance of separation, familiar dysfunction. It's a common loop in these dynamics. The loneliness of leaving feels more terrifying than the familiar chaos of staying. Then, in the fall of 2014, Daniel awoke to a nightmare that should have broken the loop forever. Alara was standing over his bed, a loaded service weapon, his service weapon, pointed directly at his temple. He was a police officer, armed and trained in de-escalation, and yet in that moment, he was just a man, frozen in his own bed, trying to use a calm voice to talk down the woman he once loved, the mother of his child. He still did not file a report. Strength itself become a trap? When your identity is tied to being the solver of problems, admitting you are the core of an unsolvable one feels like annihilation. The final catalyst was not a threat, but a glimpse of light. In January 2015, Daniel posted a simple, happy picture online with a new friend, Kara, a woman he'd met through a community event. He was smiling, a genuine, unburdened smile that hadn't graced his face in years. It was a snapshot of a life beyond the storm, a possibility of peace. Phone records later showed Alara called his cell phone 167 times in the following 72 hours. 167 calls? That's the sound of an obsession snapping. control slipping away and triggering a catastrophic system failure. It was the digital scream of someone who could not tolerate the idea of him being happy without her, them existing outside the narrative she controlled. February 5th, 2015. Daniel dropped Leo off at daycare, went to the gym, ran errands, a normal Thursday. He was likely thinking about his shift that evening, about what to make for dinner. While he was out, Ilara approached his house. She pried open a rear window, a window she knew had a faulty lock, and climbed inside. A home invasion was quiet, methodical. Once in, she went directly to his kitchen sink. She knew the combination. Took 2 of his firearms from their storage case. She made a choice that defines premeditation. She hid in a hallway closet among the winter coats and stored boxes and waited. She waited in the dark. This was not a crime of sudden passion. This was an ambush, patiently assembled from pieces of intimate knowledge, his schedule, his home's weaknesses, his security code. Daniel returned home, unaware his sanctuary had been transformed into a trap. He went about his routine, the mundane acts of a life about to end. Maybe he checked the mail, grabbed a drink of water, turned on the TV for background noise. Eventually, he entered the bathroom. As he sat on the toilet, utterly vulnerable, the closet door down the hall opened. Ilara emerged. She would later claim he lunged at her, but the forensic story was stark, pulled in gunpowder and trajectory. Daniel, unarmed, was shot first in the hand, then shots to his chest. The final, fatal round entered his forehead. Officer Daniel Reed was 32 years old. He died on the cold tile floor of the one room meant for privacy. He wasn't found until he failed to report for his evening shift, an unthinkable breach of discipline for a man like him. A concerned fellow officer performed the welfare check. The scene spoke of a calculated execution, not a struggle. Ilara, meanwhile, had already transitioned into her performance of normalcy, laughing and chatting as if it were any other day. Investigators, however, had a key piece of evidence. A neighbor's security camera had captured a figure matching Ilara's description entering the driveway. When detectives presented her with the silent footage, her constructed story crumbled. She confessed with an unsettling flatness. She even led them to a scrub-strewn field where she dumped the murder weapon in a gym bag. In her purse, detectives found a small, folded slip of paper. On it, the name Kara was scribbled, along with the young woman's workplace. A target noted, an obsession documented. This was the architecture of a premeditation, built brick by brick from jealousy and an absolute, terrifying refusal to let go. The legal battle to hold her accountable would stretch the grief into a decade-long ache. The first trial in 2019 ended with a hung jury, a single holdout refusing to convict, buying into the alternate reality the defense spun. For Daniel's family, it was a second funeral, a fresh injection of despair. Ilara's defense strategy was a classic, brutal tactic: assassinate the character of the man who could no longer defend himself. Her most explosive and baseless allegation was that she'd found disturbing illegal material in Daniel's safe, a claim investigators thoroughly disproved. But on May 8, 2025, a second jury reached a unanimous verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was 50 years to life. The long, wearying fight for legal accountability was over. Yet, the true human cost is a permanent open ledger. Leo, now a teenager, lost both parents in a single day, one to violence, the other to the prison system. He was adopted by Daniel's twin brother, Michael, growing up in a home filled with love, but also with the ghost of his father. Kara, the young woman in the photo, had her life forever altered by a stranger's obsession, becoming an unwilling footnote in a true crime story. So we return always to the haunting central question: why didn't he leave? The answer lies not in a single moment of weakness, but in the very identity that made him a good officer and a loving brother. Daniel was engineered by early trauma to endure, the fix to absorb, spent his career walking toward the sound of trouble. How could he have possibly known that this time the warning signs were a catalog of escalating terror, a syllabus he failed to read correctly, slashed furniture, sabotaged brakes, a gun to the head, 167 desperate calls. Each was rationalized away, minimized, or buried because the human mind, especially one wired for hope, will often cling to the possibility of normalcy even as the evidence of imminent catastrophe stacks up to the ceiling. This story is a stark, necessary reminder. Love should never feel like a hostage situation. It should never demand the surrender of your safety, your peace, or your very life as the price of admission. Pay attention to patterns, not promises. Trust the consistent evidence of someone's actions over the fleeting potential you see in them. And understand that the strongest among us can be rendered helpless by the very traits we admire. Their loyalty, their capacity to endure, their hope. The tragedy of Daniel Reed is not that he was weak, but that his strength was applied to a situation where the only winning move was to walk away. A move his entire life had taught him was unthinkable. What do you think? Was this a tragedy born of fatal obsession, or the inevitable end of a cycle of control that could never be broken? Share your perspective respectfully in the comments, remembering the real people, especially Leo, who live with the aftermath every single day. If you found this exploration of human behavior and its darkest consequences compelling, please support this channel. A life means a lot to us, and it helps Wines of Thought bring you more deep dive narratives that look beyond the headline and into the heart of the story. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next journey into the complexities of the human condition. Rest in peace, Daniel Reed.